How do you destroy a family that's already stolen everything from you? You don't attack them, you save them, again and again and again, until the salvation itself becomes a curse. Welcome to the channel. If you believe revenge is a dish best served ice cold, go ahead and hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe for more. You'll want to watch this all the way through because the final act of this plan demonstrates how to turn a family's greatest strengths into the very weapons that tear them apart, piece by paranoid piece. Now let's begin. The world's full of stories about the black sheep. My family wrote one for me, ending with a plane ticket and a chorus of laughter. But I'm writing the last chapter. They think they're living the high life. In reality, they're just ghosts in a house I've already foreclosed on. It's strange how a single room can hold the entire history of a betrayal. For me, it was a law office. Wood-paneled, sterile, smelling of old paper and older money. The air was thick with a particular kind of grief. The performative kind. My mother, Eleanor, dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. My father, Richard, stood with his hand on her shoulder, a perfect portrait of the stoic patriarch. My brother Mark shifted in his chair, his leg bouncing with an energy that had nothing to do with sorrow and everything to do with anticipation. And Chloe, my sister, just looked bored. They were all there playing their parts, waiting for the curtain to rise on their inheritance. I sat apart from them, not by much, just a few feet, but it might as well have been miles. I was genuinely mourning. My grandfather was the only one who had ever bothered to look past the quiet, administrative role they'd all assigned me. The family archivist. It sounded so dutiful, so harmless. They saw it as paperwork, a task beneath them, so they gave it to the girl who was also, in their eyes, beneath them. I didn't organize his life's work out of duty. I did it because I loved him. And in those boxes of stock certificates, property deeds, and old letters, I learned everything. I learned the truth of our family. He had shown me the architecture of their lives, and in doing so, he taught me where all the load-bearing walls were, and all the cracks in the foundation. I saw every hidden debt, every foolish investment Richard made, every dollar Eleanor siphoned off for her charities. I saw the real will, the one that rewarded my years of loyalty and love, and I saw the other one. The forgery he predicted they would create. He knew them so well. The lawyer, a man named Sterling, whose spine my father had purchased decades ago, cleared his throat. The performance began. He read through the bequests of the properties, the businesses, the heirlooms, all the visible, impressive burdens of a legacy they hadn't earned. To my parents, my brother, my sister. Then he got to me. Sterling wouldn't meet my eye. He just read the line from the forged document. To Jessica, a pittance. Enough to start a new life elsewhere. And a one-way, first-class plane ticket. That was my father's touch. That extra flourish of cruelty. It wasn't enough to steal my birthright. He had to frame it as an act of charity. A gentle push out of the nest. The silence that followed was broken by a snicker. It was Mark. "See?" he whispered to Chloe, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Grandpa knew you weren't cut out for this." Then the laughter. It wasn't loud. It was worse. It was a wave of quiet, condescending relief, the sound of vultures who've just been assured of their meal. My mother's pitying smile, my father's magnanimous nod as if to say, "It's for the best." They didn't just disinherit me. They didn't just steal from a dead man. In my moment of deepest grief, they held a public vote and unanimously affirmed my worthlessness. I stood up. I didn't say a word. I just walked to the lawyer's desk, picked up the plane ticket, and left. The laughter, that soft, smug sound, followed me all the way down the hall. They thought they had handed me my exile. They had no idea they had just paid for my throne. The real will, the one that gave me control of our grandfather's true fortune, a massive, liquid portfolio of secret tech investments he'd made decades ago, was exactly where he told me it would be. In a file only I knew how to access. A final gift from the one man who knew his family all too well. My new life was one of stillness, of observation. They had always seen me as a ghost in the background of their lives, so I simply leaned into the role. But now, I was a ghost with resources. Immense resources. I spent the first 6 months building my new reality. Not a life, but an infrastructure. A network of shell corporations, untraceable bank accounts, and anonymous proxies. I became a phantom on the global financial stage. My grandfather had given me the capital. His lessons in poring over documents had given me the analytical mind to weaponize it. Justice was never an option, not the conventional kind. Their power was woven into the very fabric of their community. The lawyer was bought. The judges were dinner guests. The chief of police sent a Christmas card every year to challenge them. In their world, on their terms, would have been a fool's errand. They would have painted me as a bitter, disgruntled heir, buried me in legal fees, and shredded my name in the local society pages. They worshipped two things, money and power, and they had built impenetrable walls around themselves with both. That's when I understood. True justice wouldn't come from taking their things away. That's a simple transaction, a punishment they could understand and eventually recover from. No, my revenge had to be more profound. It had to come from I would not be an attacker. I would be a mirror. I would use the very thing they worshipped against them. I would give them everything they ever wanted. I would save them again and again. I would trap them in a gilded cage of their own greed and watch as the weight of their unearned success and the ghost of their crime crushed them from the inside out. The first opportunity came sooner than I expected. Ashworth Holdings. My father's pride and joy. It was a dinosaur. A lumbering beast of old money and older ideas. Richard was a terrible businessman, blinded by arrogance and nostalgia. He'd leveraged the company to its absolute breaking point to fund a series of vanity projects. Now, a rival firm, a leaner and hungrier shark, smelled blood in the water. I watched it all unfold from thousands of miles away. I had backdoors into their servers, of course. Grandfather and I had built them years ago, a little in case of emergency project. I read the panicked emails. I listened to the frantic voicemails Richard left for his bankers, his voice stripped of its usual booming confidence, leaving only the thin, reedy tone of fear. Publicly, he was defiant. He gave a press conference, railing against corporate vultures, proclaiming that the Ashworth name was untouchable, that they would weather this storm as they had weathered all others. "Fortune favors the bold," he bellowed into the microphones. "The universe knows our family is meant to lead." I almost laughed. The universe, in this case, was me, in a penthouse apartment in Singapore, drinking green tea and monitoring his company's stock price as it plummeted toward oblivion. The takeover was scheduled to be finalized on a Friday. By Thursday evening, it was a done deal. The board had been notified. The lawyers were drawing up the final papers. My father was ruined. He just didn't know it yet. I imagined him pacing the floor of his study, the same study where my grandfather had taught me about the world, drinking a scotch and staring at a portrait of his own father, a man he'd spent his entire life failing to impress. That night, I initiated the first phase. I moved the capital through 7 different countries in less than an hour, a ghost slipping through the world's financial systems. The final entity, a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands with the delightfully bland name Providence Equity Group, made the move at 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. A massive anonymous infusion of capital. Enough to not only kill the takeover, but to buy out the rival firm's stake at a premium and stabilize the company for the foreseeable future. I watched the market open the next morning. The financial news networks were in a frenzy. A miraculous 11th hour save, one analyst called it. An anonymous benefactor, another speculated. I received a notification from my surveillance system, an audio file. It was a call between Richard and my mother. His voice was trembling, filled with a triumphant, almost religious fervor. "I told you, Eleanor, I told you. We're untouchable. Someone out there knows what we're worth. Someone important is watching over us." I leaned back in my chair. He was right. Someone important was watching. He just had no idea that her judgment would be so generous. He saw it as a miracle, a sign of his own greatness. I saw it for what it was, an investment, the first payment in the purchase of his sanity. Next came my brother, Mark. Mark was a creature of pure, unadulterated impulse. He had his father's arrogance, but none of his performative dignity. His life was a trail of fast cars, empty bottles, and bad bets. His latest indiscretion involved a rather dangerous loan shark who operated out of the back rooms of illegal poker games. The debt was 6 figures. The interest was calculated daily. The consequences for late payment were medieval. I knew this, of course, because I was reading his emails and tracking his financials. It was pathetically easy. But I decided this was a perfect opportunity to introduce a new variable into their equation: doubt. The night before the deadline, I made another transaction. It was simpler this time. A direct anonymous wire transfer to the loan shark's holding company. The debt was settled in full. I even included a little extra for his troubles. The next morning, Mark received a text message. A single sentence. "Your account is settled. Have a nice day." I watched him through the camera I'd had installed in his apartment. He just stared at the phone. His first reaction wasn't relief. It was suspicion. He immediately called our father. I listened in. "Did you pay it?" Mark demanded, his voice a mixture of confusion and accusation. Richard was silent for a moment. "Pay what? I was going to make you sweat for another day, you irresponsible brat. The debt to, you know who? It's paid." "Someone paid it." The line went quiet. I could picture Richard in his office, his brow furrowed. This didn't fit his worldview. He was the patriarch. He was the one who solved problems, who wielded the family checkbook like a scepter. An unsanctioned act of salvation was to him an act of rebellion. "It wasn't me," Richard said, his voice now cold and hard. "Who else knows? No one." "That's the point." Mark was starting to panic. Who the hell would just pay it off? Is this a trap? Is someone watching me? He lowered his voice. "Dad, was it you? Are you testing me?" And there it was. The first seed. The first crack in their monolithic certainty. Mark didn't trust the gift. He trusted no one. In his world of backstabbing and treachery, a selfless act was inconceivable. It had to be a test, a trick, a power play from someone inside the family. His paranoia was already writing a better story than I ever could. My mother, Eleanor, was next. Eleanor's domain was social power. Her currency was reputation. Her life's work was the chairmanship of the city's most prestigious children's hospital charity. It was her crown jewel, a monument to her compassion and generosity. It was also a complete fraud. I knew from my time as the archivist that for years she had been skimming from the charity. Not huge amounts. Just a little here and there, rerouted through clever accounting to fund her lifestyle. A couture gown for the annual gala, a little redecoration for the east wing of the mansion. She saw it as her due. A salary for the tiresome work of being a philanthropist. But she had gotten sloppy. An audit was coming. A new accountant on the hospital's board, someone my father hadn't been able to buy or intimidate, had insisted on it. I'd read the preliminary findings. The discrepancy was significant enough to cause a scandal. Jail time was a possibility. For Eleanor, the public humiliation would be a fate worse than death. She was starting to unravel. The surveillance I had on the house picked up hushed, frantic arguments between her and Richard. He was furious, not at the theft, but at her carelessness, at the risk she had brought to his precious family name. I waited until the day before the auditors were scheduled to present their findings to the board. Then I made my move. Another anonymous wire transfer, this time directly to the charity's primary bank account. It was for the exact amount of the discrepancy, down to the last cent, but this time I added a personal touch, a whisper from the past. In the memo line of the wire transfer, I typed 2 words. Ellie Bell. It was a private nickname. A name only one person had ever called her. My grandfather. He used it when she was a little girl, long before she had encased herself in the ice of her social ambitions. I remembered hearing him call her that once, in his study. He was looking at an old, faded photograph of her on a swing. He had a look of such profound sadness on his face. The look of a father who had lost his daughter not to death, but to life. Eleanor discovered the donation when her assistant sent her the updated financials that morning. I listened to the call she made to Richard immediately after. She wasn't relieved. She was terrified. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The money, it's there in the account." "What are you talking about?" He snapped. "Did you fix it?" "No, it was a donation. An anonymous one." She took a shaky breath. "Richard, The memo line, the note on the transfer, it said for Ellie Bell. Silence. Utter silence on the other end of the line. I knew what he was thinking. I knew what she was thinking. For the first time in their cold, transactional lives, they were confronted with the impossible. A ghost in the machine. A voice from a grave they had helped to dig. No one else knew he called me that. Eleanor finally sobbed. It's not possible. Richard, what's happening? Is this a sign? Is he punishing me for what we did? She thought it was her father's ghost, reaching out from the great beyond to pass judgment. She wasn't entirely wrong. His legacy was certainly passing judgment. It was just doing it via an encrypted VPN and a Swiss bank account. Her fear was so much more delicious than simple relief would have been. She wasn't saved. She was haunted. The dinner table became the stage for their paranoia. I watched them through the cameras, a silent member of the feast. They didn't talk to each other. They interrogated. Richard, now convinced there was a traitor in his company, stared at his son. Are you sure you didn't mention your little problem to anyone else, Mark? One of your degenerate friends? Mark sneered back. Oh, I'm sure. The same way I'm sure you didn't hire some private firm to bail out the company just to make yourself look like a genius. It was one of your partners, wasn't it? Trying to get leverage on you. Eleanor just stared at her empty plate, twisting her napkin in her hands. It's not business, she murmured, her voice hollow. This is something else. It's a warning. Chloe, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, her voice laced with weary contempt. Oh, please, Mother. Don't start with your superstitions. And you two, she said, glaring at her father and brother. You're both fools. Can't you see what's happening? This isn't a miracle, it's a game. Someone is playing with us. Someone with a lot of money and a very sick sense of humor. She looked around the table, a flicker of something like fear in her eyes. And whoever it is, she had no idea how right she was. I watched them bicker and accuse, their perfect family facade cracking under the first application of pressure. They were turning on each other just as I knew they would. Their own greed, their own guilt, their own deep-seated distrust. These were my true agents of chaos. I didn't need to attack them. I just needed to give them more of what they craved. Money, security, salvation, and watch as the inexplicable nature of the gift made them eat each other alive. I brought up a news report on another screen. A fawning business journalist was celebrating the miraculous turnaround of Ashworth Holdings. The family was being lauded for its resilience, its boldness. They call it a miracle, I whispered to the empty room. I call it an investment. Every dollar I give them buys me a piece of their sanity. Soon, I'll own it all. They thought they had won, with a forged will and a chorus of soft, condescending laughter. My family handed me a plane ticket and erased me from their lives. They believed they were cutting a loose thread, tidying up their perfect tapestry of wealth and power. They were wrong. They were simply sharpening the needle I would use to unravel it all. From the quiet of a new life, a life they funded, I began my work, not with a sword, but with a checkbook. I became their ghost, their anonymous benefactor, a miracle worker who answered their prayers before they were even uttered. For my father, Richard, I saved his failing company from a hostile takeover, a miraculous infusion of cash that he interpreted as a sign from the universe affirming his own genius. For my brother, Mark, I settled a dangerous gambling debt, a silent act of salvation that he saw not as a gift, but as a power play from an unknown rival. For my mother, Eleanor, I replaced the money she'd been stealing from her own charity, signing the anonymous donation with a childhood nickname only her father, my grandfather, had ever used. I didn't need to attack them. I just gave them what they wanted. Their fear, their greed, and their guilt did the rest. The first cracks appeared. They began to look at each other with suspicion, to whisper accusations in the long, quiet hallways of their stolen kingdom. They saw saviors and ghosts in the shadows. They had no idea the monster was the one they had created, watching them from half a world away, and that my generosity had only just begun. The first act of my play was over. They were confused, unsettled. In Act 2, they would learn to be afraid. The first phase was about establishing the pattern, the impossible salvation, the benevolent ghost. The second phase was about corrupting it. I needed to transform their miracle into a curse, to make them feel not saved but watched. Not blessed but owned. My target for this was Chloe. Chloe was different from the others. She wasn't driven by Richard's ego, Eleanor's vanity, or Mark's appetites. She was driven by a cold, practical ambition. She saw the family for what it was, a vehicle, and she was frustrated by her father's incompetence at the wheel. Her dream was to escape the provincial world of Ashworth Holdings and make a name for herself in the cutthroat art scene of New York. She had the eye, the taste, and the ruthlessness. She just didn't have the capital. Her trust fund was controlled by Richard, who considered her ambitions a frivolous distraction from her duty, which was to marry well and produce an heir. I had been tracking her for months. I read her business plans, her secret applications for loans, her bitter emails to friends complaining about our father's prehistoric mindset. She had found the perfect space for her gallery. The lease was astronomical. The renovations would cost a fortune. Every bank had turned her down. It was a pipe dream. So I made it come true. I created a new entity, the Lachlan Arts Grant. It was designed to look like one of those eccentric, old money foundations that pop up, endow a few projects, and then disappear. It had a convincing digital footprint, a board of ghost directors, and a mission statement about supporting emerging female gallerists. Chloe was, of course, the sole recipient. The letter arrived at her apartment on a Monday. Thick, cream-colored stationery, an embossed logo. It informed her that her work had come to the attention of the grant's anonymous benefactor, who was deeply impressed by her vision and wished to provide her with the full, unconditional funding to establish her gallery. No strings attached. No oversight. A blank check to build her dream. I watched her through her laptop camera. She read it 3 times. Her first reaction was disbelief. Her second was elation. A wild, disbelieving smile spread across her face. She paced her apartment, vibrating with a joy I hadn't seen in her since we were children. She thought she had finally been recognized, that the world had seen her worth even if her own family hadn't. That feeling lasted for exactly 1 hour. The paranoia was a family trait after all. It was in their blood. The questions started to bubble up. Who were these people? How did they know about her? Why her? It was too perfect. Too easy. Her joy curdled into suspicion. Her first call was to Richard. "Did you do this?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of the earlier excitement. "This Lachlan Arts Grant, is this you? Another one of your games?" I heard the irritation in Richard's voice. "A what?" "Chloe, I have more important things to worry about than your little hobby. I'm trying to find out who is making a mockery of my company." "So it wasn't you?" "It wasn't a question." "Then who was it?" "Perhaps you have an admirer," Richard said dismissively. "Now if you'll excuse me." She hung up. The seed of doubt had been planted. An admirer. The thought was more unsettling than a gift from her father. An unknown, unseen force had just made her wildest dream a reality. She was no longer in control of her own story. She took the money? Of course she did. Her ambition was stronger than her fear. The gallery, which she named De Novo, a new beginning, was a stunning success. She had impeccable taste. She poached a rising star painter for her opening exhibition. The art world was buzzing. The critics raved. For the first time, Chloe was the center of her own universe. She was a rising star. And I made sure she never forgot who lit the match. The gifts started arriving a week after the opening. Small things, anonymous. An incredibly rare bottle of champagne sent to her office with a simple, typed note. "Congratulations on your well-deserved success." A first edition of her favorite book, sourced from a collector in Prague. A custom-made piece of jewelry from an obscure designer she'd once mentioned in an email. Each gift was perfect, perfectly chosen, perfectly timed, and completely terrifying. They showed an impossible level of intimacy. They proved that her benefactor wasn't just watching her career. They were watching. They knew her tastes, her desires, her private thoughts. The gifts were no longer gifts. They were messages. They were proof of surveillance. I watched as her triumphant confidence slowly eroded. She started searching her office for bugs. She changed her passwords every day. She would stop mid-sentence during phone calls, convinced she could hear a click on the line. The gallery, her beautiful, perfect dream, started to feel like a cage. An elaborate, well-funded observation deck. She was the star of the show, but she never knew who was in the audience. Meanwhile, Richard's own paranoia was metastasizing. The miracle that had saved Ashworth Holdings had a dark side. He couldn't take credit for it because he didn't know who was responsible. And in his world, what you can't control, you must fear. He became obsessed with finding the source. He hired a team of private investigators, the most expensive and ruthless firm in the city. They were financial pit bulls, tasked with digging into Providence Equity Group. It was a joy to watch. I led them on a merry chase through a labyrinth of shell corporations and phantom holding companies. I'd created an entire mythology for my ghost. A reclusive billionaire, an eccentric foreign prince, a rival corporation playing a long game. For every layer the investigators peeled back, I had two more waiting underneath. It was a hall of mirrors, and they were spending Richard's money to run headfirst into every wall. His frustration mounted. He began to suspect everyone. His board members, his oldest business partners, even his own executives. He saw conspiracies everywhere. A casual remark in a meeting was a coded message. A friendly lunch was a secret negotiation. He tore his own company apart from the inside, searching for a traitor who didn't exist. He fired his CFO of 30 years, a man who had been loyal to a fault, because of a vague, anonymous tip I had planted about a supposed offshore account. His miracle had become his tormentor. He was the king of a castle that had been saved by a ghost, and he was willing to burn it to the ground just to see the specter in the flames. He was becoming isolated, erratic, and deeply afraid. His authority, which had always been absolute, was now a joke. Everyone knew he wasn't in control. Everyone whispered about the mystery investor. He had been saved, but he had lost his power, and for Richard, that was a fate worse than bankruptcy. And then there was Mark. Dear, predictable Mark. Predictably, he had interpreted his first salvation not as a warning, but as a safety net. He believed he was untouchable, that the same mysterious force that had cleared his debt would always be there to catch him. So he doubled down. He escalated. He moved from poker games to high stakes, unregulated stock market speculation. He was borrowing money from even more dangerous people, not just thugs who break fingers, but financiers who ruin lives with a single phone call. He lost. Of course he lost. He lost spectacularly. The debt this time was in the 7 figures. It was a sum that even Richard, in his current chaotic state, couldn't cover without liquidating a major asset and inviting public scrutiny. Mark was trapped. And this time he was terrified on a whole new level. He didn't call Richard. He knew it was useless. Instead, I watched him through the cameras in his penthouse as he paced like a caged animal. He was drafting a suicide note. It was pathetic, full of self-pity and blame for everyone but himself. He was going to take the coward's way out. I couldn't allow that. It was too easy, too neat. His story wasn't over. So once again, I intervened. But this time, the salvation came with a price. The creditor was a notoriously ruthless hedge fund manager, a man who enjoyed destroying people. I made another anonymous transfer, clearing Mark's debt completely. But the next morning, a package was delivered to Mark's door, a sleek black box. Inside, on a bed of velvet, was a single custom-made chess piece. A pawn carved from white ivory. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was clear. Your life, your debts, your very existence, they are not your own. You have been bought. You have a new owner. His reaction was not relief. It was a complete and total psychological collapse. I watched him stare at that pawn for hours. He threw it against the wall, but a few minutes later, he would pick it up and stare at it again. The anonymous savior was gone. In his place was an anonymous master, a silent, all-powerful entity that could save him or crush him at will. He wasn't just being watched. He was being controlled. He had lost the one thing he valued even more than money, his illusion of free will. He stopped leaving his apartment. He started drinking heavily. He was a prisoner in his own home, haunted by the symbol of his own insignificance. While her children and husband were spiraling, Eleanor was retreating into a world of superstition. The memory of Bell had shaken her to her core. She had interpreted it as a supernatural judgment from her dead father. She became obsessed with the past, with looking for signs and portents. She spent hours in my grandfather's old study, which had been left untouched, as if searching for clues. I decided it was time for the ghost to speak to her again. Her great shame, the secret she thought she had buried forever, was a hit-and-run accident she'd been involved in as a teenager. A moment of panic and cowardice. My grandfather had been the one to fix it. He'd made the problem go away, paid off the victim's family, and pulled strings to make the police report disappear. But he had made her promise she would never forget the name of the young man she had hit. His name was Daniel. It was the week of the annual hospital charity gala, Eleanor's crowning social event of the year. She was the chairwoman. Her face was on the invitations. This year, the hospital was dedicating a new pediatric wing. She'd been working on it for years. It was to be the pinnacle of her philanthropic career. 2 days before the gala, another anonymous donation appeared in the charity's accounts. A massive one. The largest single donation in its history. Enough to fund the entire new wing for a decade. The hospital board was ecstatic. Eleanor was terrified. She knew what was coming. She checked the wire transfer details with trembling hands. In the memo line, there was a single word. I listened to the recording from the bug I'd placed in the study. It was a single guttural scream of pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't my grandfather's ghost. She knew that now. A ghost might be able to whisper a nickname, but a ghost wouldn't know about Daniel. A ghost wouldn't have access to international bank accounts. This was something else, something human, someone who knew everything, every secret, every sin. She called Richard hysterical. He knows, Richard. He knows about Daniel. Who is this? Who is doing this to us? Richard, consumed by his own paranoid fantasies, had no comfort to offer. It's one of them, he snarled. One of my partners. They're digging up dirt on us, Eleanor. Trying to get leverage. We're under attack. This isn't business, she shrieked. This is personal. This is a punishment. And right there, in that moment, the entire dynamic of their family shattered. The external threat had finally and completely breached their walls and set up camp in the center of their lives. Their home was no longer a fortress. It was a haunted house. They were no longer a family. They were a collection of terrified suspects, locked in a room with a judge they couldn't see. The night of the gala was the climax. They had to be there. The public image had to be maintained. So they stood on that stage, a perfect picture of a philanthropic, successful family, while the hospital president gave a gushing speech, thanking the angel donor who had made the new Daniel Wing possible. I watched it all on a live stream, from my apartment on the other side of the world. I watched as hundreds of people gave them a standing ovation. Applause for their generosity, their compassion. And I saw the looks on their faces, the frozen smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The terror, the shame, the absolute soul-crushing humiliation of being celebrated for a salvation that felt like a damnation. They were trapped in a prison of my generosity. Every good thing that happened to them was now a source of terror. Every success was a reminder of their powerlessness. I had not taken a single thing from them. I had given them everything, and it was destroying them. I raised my glass of tea to the screen, to the beautiful broken family I had built. The transition was complete. Their benevolent ghost was now their tormentor. Their home was a prison. Their success was a curse. They were no longer fighting an outside threat, and that was a war they could never win. My generosity had become a poison. In the second act of my story, I watched as the antidote I administered became the very thing that sickened them. My sister Chloe built her dream gallery with my money, only to find that every success, every perfectly chosen gift, was a reminder that she was a specimen in a jar, her life observed by an unseen and omniscient force. Her dream became her prison. My father, Richard, once a titan in his own mind, became a paranoid wreck. The miracle that saved his company became a riddle he couldn't solve, turning him against his allies and hollowing out his empire from the inside as he searched for a ghost. My brother Mark learned the hard way that his safety net had been replaced with a leash. Saved from ruin a second time, he was given a token, a pawn, to remind him of his new station in life. He was no longer a player. He was a piece, owned and controlled. His fear was so much more satisfying than his ruin would have been. And my mother, Eleanor, who first feared the judgment of a ghost, was now haunted by something far more terrifying, a mortal who knew her deepest, darkest secret. The name Daniel, attached to a donation that saved her reputation, became the brand on her soul. I had them. All of them. They stood on a stage, accepting applause for my actions, their smiles like masks on skulls. They were no longer a family, but a collection of inmates in a prison of my design, each trapped in a cell of their own making. The foundation was gone. The walls were cracked. All that was left was to watch the whole rotten structure come crashing down. The end did not come with a bang. It came with a whisper, a series of quiet internal collapses that cascaded into a final spectacular implosion. They had been hollowed out, their foundations eroded by suspicion and fear. All I had to do was wait for the inevitable tremor. It began, as it had to, with Richard. His paranoia had consumed him. Having failed to find the external source of his salvation and torment, he had concluded with the twisted logic of a desperate man that the threat must be internal. He fixated on a single idea: that a rival faction on his own board of directors was orchestrating this elaborate psychological campaign to seize control of Ashworth Holdings. It was absurd, but it was the only narrative that allowed him to maintain his sense of agency. He wasn't being haunted. He was being attacked. He called an emergency meeting. I patched into the boardroom's audio-visual system. He stood before the men and women who had served his family for generations, his eyes wild, his voice trembling with rage. He accused them of treason. He presented a chaotic web of circumstantial evidence, misinterpreted emails, imagined slights, the ravings of the private investigators I had led on a wild goose chase. He demanded a loyalty vote. He wanted to purge the company of his imagined enemies. He thought it would be a show of strength, a reassertion of his power. He believed they would fall in line, as they always had. But he had fundamentally misunderstood his position. He was no longer the patriarch they feared and respected. He was an unstable, paranoid liability. The mystery investor, the entity I had created, held all the real power now. The board knew that whoever saved the company once could just as easily let it die. Their loyalty was no longer to the Ashworth name, but to the anonymous force that guaranteed their paychecks. The vote was a catastrophe. Not a single hand was raised in his favor. It was a silent, unanimous, brutal rejection. I watched the blood drain from his face. In a single moment, he saw the truth. He wasn't the king. He wasn't even a player. He was a relic. He did not rage. He did not yell. He simply deflated. He stumbled out of the room, a broken man. The next morning, he initiated a leveraged buyout, a desperate, final gamble to reclaim absolute control. He poured every last cent of the family's liquid assets, mortgaged every property they owned, and leveraged the company's stock to buy out the board and take the company private. It was a move of pure ego and desperation. It was also financial suicide. He was borrowing against an inflated stock price that was entirely propped up by my secret capital. The moment the buyout was complete, I pulled my support. I didn't sell aggressively. That would have been too obvious. I just stopped buying. I let the market correct itself. The stock price, which had been artificially inflated for months, collapsed. It fell 90% in a single day. The banks called in their loans. Richard was wiped out. Utterly. He hadn't just lost the company. He had vaporized the entire family fortune. A century of accumulated wealth, gone in an afternoon. The home they lived in, the cars they drove, the art on their walls. It all belonged to the banks now. He had burned his own kingdom to the ground, just to prove he was still king. Eleanor's collapse was quieter, but no less complete. The public humiliation of the bankruptcy was a heavy blow, but her real torment was internal. She was convinced that their ruin was a divine punishment for her past sins. The name Daniel was a brand on her soul. She began talking, to anyone who would listen. At first, it was quiet confessions to her priest. Then, more public displays. She started attending grief counseling groups, not for the loss of her fortune, but for the hit and run she'd committed 40 years ago. She would stand up and tell the whole story to a room full of strangers, weeping, begging for an absolution that would never come. The story found its way to a local reporter. It was a minor scandal at first, a gossip column item about the strange behavior of the recently disgraced socialite. But then the family of Daniel, the victim from all those years ago, came forward. They had been paid off, yes, but they had never known the full story. They had been told it was a tragic, unsolved accident. The press descended. The story of the wealthy teenager who had killed a young man and whose powerful father had covered it up was a media firestorm. The name Eleanor Ashworth, once synonymous with charity and high society, was now linked forever with cowardice and corruption. She had achieved what I never could have. She had systematically and publicly dismantled the family's reputation, brick by painstaking brick. She didn't just tarnish their name. She erased it and wrote a new, uglier one in its place. Her desperate search for forgiveness had led her to her own damnation. In the midst of this chaos, Mark made his final move. He was a prisoner in his Ypres penthouse, which the bank was now in the process of seizing. He was broke, disowned by what was left of his family, and haunted by the ivory pawn that sat on his mantelpiece, a constant reminder of his powerlessness. He still believed that he was a piece in a game being played by one of his father's rivals. And in his drug-addled paranoia, he decided he had one last card to play: a bargaining chip. He called a reporter from a national business journal, the kind that specialized in corporate takedowns. He offered them everything. Decades of the Ashworth family's real books. Not the clean, audited versions the public saw, but the secret ledgers my grandfather had kept. The ones that detailed every bribe, every illegal political donation, every tax evasion scheme. The true history of how their fortune was built and maintained. He thought he was selling out his father's enemies. He thought he was giving the reporter the ammunition to expose the people who had been tormenting him. He had no idea he was simply reading from a script I had written. I had made sure he knew where to find those ledgers years ago. A little piece of information I had planted during a casual conversation. A seed that had finally borne its poisonous fruit. The exposé was biblical. It didn't just ruin Richard's legacy. It salted the earth where it had been buried. Federal investigations were launched. The full weight of the system they had so expertly manipulated for so long came crashing down on them. Mark, the star witness, was given immunity in exchange for his testimony. He had saved himself by sacrificing everyone else. It was the most predictable and most fitting end for him. A final selfish act of self-preservation. And Chloe? Chloe was the only one who understood. She didn't know it was me. She never would. But she knew that the force that had destroyed her family was not random. It was intelligent. It was methodical. And it was, in its own way, just. I watched her through the airport security cameras. A week after the story broke, she emptied her gallery. She sold the art, paid her employees a generous severance, and wired the remaining millions from the Lachlan Arts Grant to a charity for victims of financial crime. It was a quiet, elegant act of repudiation. She was the only one who refused to be a pawn. Then, she disappeared. She left a short, final email for her parents. I read it, of course. It said, "You built this house. Now you can haunt it. Goodbye." She was the only one who escaped. The only one who chose to walk away from the game entirely. I like to think that, in her own way, she was the only one who truly understood the lesson. And so, my work was done. The empire was in ashes. The name was a disgrace. The family was a collection of broken, isolated people, haunted by their own choices. I had held up a mirror, and they had shattered themselves against their own reflection. For a long time, I told myself it was justice. A perfectly balanced equation. I took nothing from them they hadn't already stolen from my grandfather, and from me. I simply gave them the rope, and with their own greed, they braided the noose and kicked away the chair. But as I stand here now, in the quiet of my new life, the silence is loud. The victory is hollow. I won the war, but I am the only one left on the battlefield. I am the sole survivor of a family I destroyed. They laughed at me when they sent me away. A soft, condescending wave of laughter that echoed in my head for years. The echo is gone now. It has been replaced by silence. A profound, endless silence. The question that haunts me now in the long hours before the dawn is this: was it worth it? I have my grandfather's fortune. I have my freedom. I have the quiet satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed, but I am still the family archivist. And the final entry in our history is the one I wrote. It's a story of revenge, a story of justice. It is also the story of how I became the last ghost in a house full of them, and how in the end, I was left to haunt myself. And there it is. A perfectly executed plan where the ultimate punishment wasn't ruin, but a twisted salvation. She gave them everything they wanted, and in the end, it was a victory so total, it left her completely alone. Thank you so much for sticking with this all the way to the end. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button. And I have to ask, what do you think? Was this perfect justice? Or did she just become the last ghost in a house she herself destroyed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. To make sure you never miss another story, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And if you want to support the channel, the best thing you can do is share this video with someone who loves a truly strategic takedown. Until next time, stay patient, stay deliberate.